The Cuban Revolution. If you're going to want to know how the Cuban Revolution started, you're going to have to know the life and story of Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro was born in 1926, in Byron, Cuba. He grew up in a wealthy sugar farm. Born with his biological dad, Angel Castro, and his wife, Lina Ruz Gonzalez. Born with 5 brothers. Castro was a smart child, professional athlete and basketball player. As he got older, he was interested in imperialism and politics. Even going to the University of Havana to study law. Cuba in the early 1900s was very corrupt. Cuba was economically poor, followed by widespread misuse of state resources, theft-ridden cities, and an extreme boom in prostitution. Some Americans nicknamed Cuba as a whorehouse. Castro was a very determined man, and followed through his goals set to him, thoroughly. His main intentions, as a teenager, was to fix the problems that Cuba was facing. In 1948 he got married to Marta Francisca de la Caridad Diaz-Balart. Shortly after his marriage, he had a baby boy, then ran for Congress, vowing to get rid of Cuba's corrupt cities. But in 1953, Fulgencio Batista won the Cuban favor as president. People protested across the streets of Cuba to remove Batista out of power. Batista was hated because he changed Cuba's government type from a democracy to a dictatorship. Batista only made Cuba for rich Americans, having massive American businesses, to be held here, making the majority of Cuban civilians rather poor. And prostitution and American mafia groups corrupt Cuba even more. Castro decided to start a rebellion in order to overthrow the government. Fidel Castro made a 16-caravan crew full of 120 angry, armed protesters to fight with him. Their first attack was on the army barracks, but his attack failed. About 60 died and most of his militia, including Castro, imprisoned. Castro was sentenced 15 years in prison. In prison, Castro would read for hours on end, up to 12, 14, or 18 hours a day. Castro's prison sentence was reduced to 2 years. After his release, he left the country to organize another invasion. He immigrated on a small peninsula in Mexico. He trialed in Florida to raise money for guns and proper equipment. Fidel Castro launched his attack in 1956 with over 80 men ready to take on Cuba. Batista's and Castro's troops engaged in combat, with only 20 men surviving and running away into the mountains. From there on the little ground that he had, he trained and built his small army, full of all types of people, regardless of ethnicity. Women, black, Hispanic, Caucasian. People cheered him on, for the race of power, having handfuls of people joining his regime every day. Castro wanted to achieve his goal by using guerrilla warfare and hit-and-run tactics. Planting bombs on buses, starting fires in oil companies, even starting his own propaganda. Even having the New York Times lie about the size of his military, to fool Batista. Once Castro fully liberated Cuba, Batista fled and immigrated in the United States, Florida, until he got shot to death. A year later, Castro was officially Prime Minister of Cuba. Most people favored Castro. Castro cleared corruption in Cuba almost completely. Even adored by Americans, involved into talk shows, and sharing great relation with Richard Nixon. Shortly after regaining power in Cuba, Castro turned sour on his great nation. People thought he was going to be a good leader, but they were wrong. He had political goals he wanted to achieve, to make Cuba a more happier place, but lied on political promises, tearing down American businesses, and restoring them for Cuban commercial reasonings. Due to the rash decisioning, the US refused to buy sugar, or supply Cuba with oil. John F. Kennedy signed a 50-year trade embargo on Cuba. Though this tightened relations with America, but not with the Soviet Union. The Soviets took this great opportunity to try to overthrow the United States government. Since Cuba is close to the USA, this would prove a military advantage to the Russians. The Russians supplied Cuba with Soviet tanks and assault rifles too, due to these new diplomatic relations. In 1960, a boat exploded, killing 120 and injuring 40 civilians. Castro suggested that this is a simple form of American sabotage. The American CIA, or known as the Central Intelligence Agency, started targeting Fidel Castro. Castro survived over 100 assassination attempts. American spies tried to poison his cigarettes to exploding pens and pills. Cuban exiles, or those who fled the country, were allowed to have a full-fledged Cuban invasion with the use of American bombers and guns. American planes, painted to look like Cubans' planes, bombarded Nicaraguan airfields to postpone Cuban plane production. During the war, Castro fully converted into Marxist-Leninism, basically changing government type to fit in with the Russians suitably. Cuba was now a communist country. Cuba was though temporarily economically poor, due to the lack of goods being let in from the United States. Having Cuban civilians, poor, or without food, some Cuban civilians made makeshift boats out of clothes and mattresses to cross a 20,000-kilometer sea, just to illegally immigrate into Florida. But that soon changed, when Cuba fully converted into a Marxist. The Soviets economically boosted Cuba enormously. At that time, the Soviets were ready for nuclear warfare. The Soviet Union sent out supply ships over the Atlantic to Havana, Cuba, where nuclear warheads will be secretly places in makeshift missile silos. The United States put the nuclear warheads in Ankara, Turkey. Both had strategic points to hit each other's capital. Either it was Washington, D.C. or Moscow. This led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, where almost all Soviet and Cuban missile sites were ready for conventional deployment. U.S. spy planes tracked the alarming rate these missiles were being set up. A single spark could end in a nuclear winter. The Russian president, Nikita Khrushchev, knew that Fidel Castro didn't have all of his morals, and he was ready to die for his country in a nuclear blowout. A year before the Soviet collapse, Nikita retracted his warheads back to base. Yet though the Russians and the USA had to sign a peace treaty, the US and Russia still has tensions today. Russia was no longer communist, and had to stop supplying Cuba economically. Though Cuba did fight off the exiles successfully, and still had some leftover tanks, it was hard to produce a standard living life for Cubans, or military goods. Though most of US forces were concentrated on the Vietnam War, other communist parties looked up to Castro as a figurehead. Castro was ready to set out his daring ambition to spread socialist ideas to the world. Starting in sub-Saharan Africa, in the country of Angola. Angola was in a civil war at the time, as the MPLA African rebels desperately needed help to fight of UNITA forces. Though communist MPLA forces did win Angola, the United States forced to resign from conflict. Signing a peace treaty with Angola, Castro was out of ideas to spread his diplomatic beliefs. As he got older, he started to lose his spark that he once had. President Jimmy Carter tried to raise new relations with Cuba after the Cold War. Most of Castro's life was private, he kept to himself, and his family business was off limits to the public. The CIA stopped trying to kill political offenders, and told Castro up front all of his assassination attempts. Though Castro was not disturbed about this, Castro was rather upset about his defeat. In the Cold War, if anybody talked anything political, or tried to rebel against Cuba, or fled the country, was killed. But shortly after his insane killing spree, he had to change government type from a communist to a democracy. Now Cuba at the time was the third poorest countries, but as time went on, and as relations with Cuba strengthened, the US raised the trade embargo. trying to making living in Cuba more easier. When Barack Obama was president, it was up to him, and upcoming Donald Trump, to tighten their trust with Cuba till this day. But Castro's suffering from gastrointestinal diseases. But he was rather a very healthy man, his entire life. But in 2016 Fidel Castro died of old age. Miguel Diaz-Canel took Castro's place at the end of it all. Thanks for watching this new entertaining Cuban documentary.